Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. And remember, if you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. What's up, everybody? This week's episode of Hidden Forces is phenomenal, and the overtime is even better because Jamie Metzl and I spent it talking about all the crazy geopolitical news that dropped last week. I know what you're all thinking, wait, I thought this episode was about futuristic stuff like biohacking and gene editing. It is. And it's a testament to Jamie's intellect that he can write a book on genetic engineering while also being an expert in national security and foreign affairs with a PhD in Asian history from Oxford. Wikipedia describes Jamie Metzl as, quote, an American technology futurist, geopolitical expert, and writer. But he's also a novelist, an entrepreneur, and a media commentator. He's authored 6 books, including one with his former boss, Richard Clarke, who he worked for at the State Department and during his time serving in the National Security Council. If that name sounds familiar, it's because it's the same Richard Clarke who was National Coordinator for Counterterrorism during the late Clinton and early Bush administrations. Clarke became the stand-in whipping boy for anyone opposed to the Iraq War in the spring of 2004, when he published a memoir about his service in government, which was highly critical of the Bush administration's attitude towards counterterrorism before the 9/11 attacks. He also testified before the 9/11 Commission, which we discussed during the overtime of episode 72 with Senator Bob Kerrey, who served on that commission. If any of this sounds remotely interesting to you, I suggest you subscribe to our Patreon overtime feed and delight yourself with 30 minutes of hardcore geopolitical history and current affairs, including a discussion about U.S.-China relations, North Korea's nuclear program, post-Soviet Russian history, Iraq, Iran, and so much more. In terms of the full episode that you're all about to listen to today, it focuses on the subject of Jamie's latest book, Hacking Darwin, and about what's happening at the cutting edge of genomic science, synthetic biology, and big data. Stuff like designer babies, biohacking, bringing back the woolly mammoth, and creating hard drives out of organic tissue dense enough to store the entire internet 10 times over. But it's also an honest conversation about the ethics and prudence of human innovation and how it's creating a world that, to many of us, no longer feels like home. I asked Jamie about the social, political, and economic implications of such a world where wealthy, well-connected elites or nations with authoritarian governments and little regard for human rights are able to get their hands on these technologies before the general public, how we can expect to navigate such a world, and what it all means for you. So with that, please enjoy my very geeky conversation with Jamie Metzl. Jamie Metzl, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks, Dimitri. Happy to be here.
I just asked you before we turned on the microphones how you pronounced your name, and it reminded me of a conversation I had with, I can't remember who it was. We were talking about, it was David Weinberger, and I was screwing up his name, and he said that when he was growing up, kids would say, "Do you want some wine with that burger?" Did people come up with names for you around pretzel, like Jamie Pretzel Metzl or something?
You know, this is this kind of thing where for everybody who has like a name that's at all interesting, at various points in your life, people will get this little light bulb above their head and they're like, oh, I'm the first person to think that Metzel rhymes with pretzel. This is going to be really witty. And it's like, God, you're like the 10,000th person. But it's the first time you've figured it out, which is great.
Oh, man. That's exactly what happened before we turned on the microphones. I was like, pretzel.
Yep.
Well, I'm glad I made fun of it afterwards because it brought some levity to it. Well, it's great having you on the show.
Thanks.
I told you I read your book. Great book. I watched your episode with Joe Rogan. How was that, by the way?
It was great. I mean, Joe's a great guy. We had a wonderful conversation. And so for someone like me, I write a book like this. If the only people who read this book are people who listen to NPR, I've failed. I mean, what I'm really I've written a book about the future of human genetic engineering, which is going to touch everybody. And I'm really trying to reach everybody. And whether it's, I did an interview yesterday with this wonderful guy, a comedian who does a lot of his interviews from a rig of his truck. Joe Rogan, it's been downloaded 3 million times.
Man,
and it's just connecting with people all around the world, and that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Doing Joe Rogan's podcast is like doing a network. Bigger than any network today. Yeah,
it's
bigger. But like old days.
Yeah, I know. So people are trying to get into the Today Show and all
cares?
these, and Good Morning America. I mean, Joe Rogan is way bigger. And the thing I loved about Joe, he's just really open-minded. He's just kind of, let's see where the wind takes us, which is great.
He was also, I mean, Joe's no idiot, but there's some subjects he knows better than others, and I was really surprised at how much he knew about this.
Yeah, no, he was great.
Yeah, so, well, it's great having you on. There's so much to talk about. I put together this rundown here, and it's focused mainly on genetic engineering. I also threw in synbio and biotech and some stuff around AI, just because a lot of that stuff touches on it, and I know that you talk about it and think about it.
Right.
What do you consider yourself?
I'm a technology futurist and geopolitical expert.
Right, okay.
And basically what I'm trying to do is to look at what are the biggest forces changing the world around us and to understand them and to explain them. And because these issues, the geopolitical changes, primarily the rise of China, and the technological changes, this super convergence of technologies that are going to change our lives across the board, there's two huge stories and they're connected to each other. So I'm really trying to tell the story of everything in the way people can understand.
Well, we're recording this on Wednesday the 29th, right? Today is the 29th of May.
Yeah.
That story came out about rare earth minerals and the Chinese restricting their export. What do you think of that?
Well, China is going to use the leverage that it has to fight in this trade war. Certainly, China has taken advantage of its access to the global trading community, particularly since it joined the WTO. It was inevitable because of China's strategy of stealing as much as it could and gaming the system that there was going to be a response. And now we're in a bit of a knife fight. I certainly wouldn't have done it the way that Donald Trump has done it. I think that we would have been in a much stronger position had we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP, the Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, because then the U.S. would have been this colossus basically dominating global trade. We're in a much weaker position. But this is a fight, and it's really serious, and leadership of the world in the 21st century is in many ways at stake.
You mean you would have done TPP, you would have and focused on, let's say, holding them accountable for IP and stuff like that separately?
Yeah, so I think what I would have done is I would have rallied the rest of the world because everybody is worried about China.
That's another thing that's totally crazy.
Yeah, so don't pick a fight with Canada. Don't pick a fight with Europe. To say that we, Canada, Europe, Japan, we're all going to stand together and we're going to say this is what we expect for anybody, China or any other country that wants to access and benefit from this free trade system. If you do it, we welcome you. If not, we are going to box you out. And that's so right now, China has this opportunity to go around us, to go to our allies and make side deals with them. So we're in a much weaker position than we otherwise could be.
Yeah, also, you don't prod North Korea with a stick, pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, piss off Europe, piss off the Canadians, and then try to negotiate a deal with China. Makes no sense at all.
It makes
but
no sense.
a lot of people think that Donald Trump is sort of, there's a method to the madness. I don't think so. I think there is a method to it, but I don't know that method is, first of all, even if that method works in other domains, let's say it does, it doesn't mean that it works when you're president of the United States, right?
Well, there may be a method, but it may not be a method that benefits the United States. I mean, I think what the method is that he has this one thesis, which is true, and he's proven true, is that if you dominate the media, it doesn't matter how. It doesn't matter whether it's good stories or bad stories. So the goal, like even this whole negotiation with North Korea in mind, and I've been saying this publicly since the beginning, it's been a sham. There's never been any prospect of North Korean denuclearization, but the goal was to generate stories, to have media buzz. And so every one of these problems that are created, that's the goal, and it's working.
What a stupid thing to attack North Korea with, not literally militarily, but in the way he has, and then pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Why on earth would North Korea ever give up their nuclear missiles if you just pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal?
So
that makes no sense at all.
Like, if we were able to get basically the exact Iran nuclear deal with North Korea, just cross out Iran and put in North Korea, it would be this incredible triumph. Donald Trump would be jumping up and down for joy, and it's way more than we could even dream of getting with North Korea. So there's this chaos, and even his own advisors are trying to hold the line. There was a thing in the New York Times yesterday, John Bolton. I mean, John Bolton is kind of a lunatic himself, but at least he has a consistent philosophy. And it's really worrying because this isn't reality television. This is the United States of America. And there's a reason why the U.S. plays the role that we do in the world, is that we didn't used to play it. And certainly in the period leading up to and the First World War, and between the First and Second World War, the world fell apart. And the U.S. is playing this role for our own good. And we've done a great job. And we're just hacking away at this international system that we've helped build without a sense of what comes next.
I think it's great. I think there are positives to having Donald Trump in office because I think he's been a catalyst for much needed change and debate, because I think the Washington establishment has gone off its rocker. And also the establishment, to use that term, is responsible for the Iraq War, right? So they're not exactly omniscient, and the public knows that.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly we need some change. But throwing a hand grenade is a form of change, and I think that given...
It's super dangerous.
It's dangerous.
And John Bolton, you mentioned it, he's the only neocon in the administration, right?
Well, yes,
Crystal's
maybe.
On the outs with the Trump administration.
The whole thing is, it doesn't even matter what these individuals' philosophies are, because wherever you go to have power, you need to suck up to Donald Trump. Look at Mike Pompeo. I mean, who knows what he stands for, if anything? But the mission is Donald Trump says something or tweets something, and then you have to strike a balance. If you're a cabinet secretary, strike a balance between doing your job and not violating whatever has been said or tweeted. So it's really an unfortunate and chaotic situation. I've worked with Democrats and Republicans my whole life, and yes, the post-war consensus, I mean, that was bound to fray anyway. And yes, we need change. We need to do things differently, but this is not, in my mind, the best way to do it.
I want to get to your book and to the subject of the episode, the formal subject, though I do want to get back to these topics. But I want to ask you one more thing.
Sure.
Are you concerned about the geopolitical dynamics? And particularly, do you think there's been a lot of talk about sending troops to Iran?
Yeah. We are sending troops to Iran.
So we are sending them.
1,500.
Are they on their way already?
They're on their way, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Where are they going there from?
From here.
From here?
Yeah.
So when they say they're sending them to Iran, what does that mean?
They're not going to it. They're going to
they're
the
going
Gulf.
to the border.
To the
they're
Gulf.
going to the Persian Gulf. Wow.
Yeah. No, this is it.
I mean, what if there's crossfire? What if something happens? What if a mistake happens?
Yeah. The U.S. has a really important global role of maintaining peace and security, but we need to do it wisely. And we need to have consistency. One of the reasons it's important that the U.S. President of the United States have a credible voice is when the President of the United States says something, it has to mean something. That's why we can survive without an army of 10 million people to help police the world. And so right now there's just a lot of uncertainty. Nobody knows what Trump is going to do. And in some ways, maybe that creates advantages, but it really makes everybody around the world feel uneasy. And what we want is security and stability. What we want is trade and growth and all of those things. And there certainly are some countries, particularly China, that have been gaming us for a lot of years. And we need to stand up to that, but we need to be smart.
Did you see the Mueller press conference at DOJ?
Yep.
What do you think of that?
So, he is such a conservative guy. His whole brand is he's by the book and he's a Boy Scout. But certainly he was delivering a message to Barr and saying, hey, your characterization of the report is not wrong. And he said, if we had found that the Trump administration and Donald Trump had not broken the law, we would have said so.
Yeah.
So that means
that's pretty
we didn't
damning.
find that he didn't break the law. And he said we were bound to not charge. We had no option of charging the president and every American should be concerned about Russian interference, and other branches of Congress should investigate. So I think that's pretty clear.
It sounded even, I mean, you're depicting it correctly, but listening to it sounded much worse than that. If I was the president of the United States, I'd be shitting my pants.
Well, every time we say that, and yet there's this momentum Donald Trump has done just a great job of controlling the narrative. I think, again, that's his great insight, is if you control the narrative, everything else just kind of passes through. Every day there's another big expose somewhere, and it just kind of passes through. Maybe it will all add up, and certainly we thought that with Democratic control of the House, there was going to be more accountability. We haven't seen that. The administration is just flagrantly flouting the norms of our democracy, not sending people to testify in contempt of Congress. And so hopefully there'll be some accountability. And that's not a Democratic position. I think all of us, all Americans, we live in a system that's based on this balance of power. And we don't know who's going to be the president. These issues could be just as well the issues with the Democratic president. We need to really focus on strong institutions and a culture of our democracy.
I think both sides of the aisle have lost so much credibility, and so has the media. I think we're in a very different place politically and culturally than we were during Watergate. You know what I mean? Because I think they see it politically. Yeah. People see it through a political lens.
Yeah, well, in Watergate, we still had this political culture. I mean, we had the culture in the 1940s where everybody was together and we were fighting this war. And then in the later 40s and the 50s, I mean, there was a sense we have this great new responsibility. We're building our country, rebuilding the world. And then things started to break down. And Watergate was this low point of feeling that, well, this culture of confidence and certainty that we'd had in our democracy was breaking down. But now it's so much worse. I mean, when people think about our democracy, they think it's stable because you go to Washington, you see these buildings, they're concrete buildings, you're voting for people. But all democracies, all political systems are cultures. It's the stuff that you don't see is more important than the stuff you see. And so there's a reason why people don't go around and running every red light or killing people, and that we internalize these structures. But once we have the voice from the top saying, hey, it's okay, you don't need to follow the law, culture doesn't matter, you see what happens in society. I lived in Cambodia for 2 years, and I saw firsthand what happens when a political culture breaks down, and that's really scary for everybody.
I'm also worried that Donald Trump will welcome a conflict, that he'll push it. This is not the first time that presidents have either gone to war or used foreign policy as a tool for domestic advantage. Even the Nixon team, before Nixon became president, I think before he even won the Republican nomination, I can't remember when it was, when he and Kissinger undermined talks that the LBJ was having with Vietnam. Clinton bombed Bosnia during the Lewinsky scandal. You know, whether that was done in order to distract the nation's attention or not, it certainly did. And Wag the Dog was a movie that was made based off of that war, right? So, I mean, there's no reason to, I mean, of all the people in the world, I would imagine Donald Trump would feel the least conflicted about using foreign policy as a tool to distract the nation or to create some kind of national emergency. I'm not, by the way, I don't talk politics on the program, so listeners should know I'm not making a political statement here. I'm just stating the obvious. I just think it seems very obvious to me, and it's not a political critique.
Well, this feels like a very volatile time. Like the center of our political culture is breaking down, and we don't have anything new to replace it. And so it's a very vulnerable time. People are afraid. We have the president of the United States is stoking fear and stoking division, and there's just a lot of unease, and crazy stuff can happen. We've been relatively lucky that it hasn't, really bad things haven't happened, but you just never know. And that's why in peace times like now, we need to be investing in the things that bring us together and having a political culture that's cohesive and not pitting people against each other, but 100%. Saying, how can we collaborate? Because there will be tough times. And if we haven't prepared in the easy times for the tough times, then we're really in trouble.
I'm with you 100%. I did the very last episode that I did was with Eve Ensler.
Right.
Right, exactly. And this was what I said, which is that, I don't see eye to eye with Eve Ensler. We come from completely different perspectives. But I didn't bring her on the program so I could debate with her or have a, some sort of adversarial discussion. I brought her on because I genuinely want to learn her perspective because she's from a different world than I am, right?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, if we
can't listen to each other,
what happens?
So we're in total agreement, Jamie.
Yeah.
So let's get to the subject of your really great book, and then I'm sure we'll get back into what we're talking about now because it's so timely and interesting. Your book, it begins by, we did an episode with Eric Schott, I should let listeners know, episode 15, where we spent a good chunk of the beginning of the episode. Eric Schott of the Icahn Institute, founder of the Icahn Institute and Semaphore Genomics. And we spent the beginning of that episode discussing what a gene is, the chemistry and molecular chemistry of DNA. So for anyone that's interested in getting into that stuff, because Jamie talks about that in chapter 1, I think that's chapter 1 is devoted to that. So we're not going to discuss that here because there's so much other interesting stuff to discuss. But Jamie, do you want to give me a synopsis, or for our listeners, a synopsis of the book and why you wanted to write it?
Yeah, that's great. So as everybody knows, the blueprint for us is our genome. And so when you have your mother's egg, your father's sperm fertilizes that egg, and that begins the process of you. And every one of your cells has that code, which tells the whole story of what you are going to be in many ways. And for 4 billion years, since we and all of life on Earth began as single-cell organisms, we've evolved by these tools of random mutation and natural selection we call Darwinian evolution. And now, for the first time ever, we are increasingly gaining the ability to rewrite the code of life, of the life around us and the life within us. And that is going to change everything. We understand that our information technology is readable and writable and hackable, but we are increasingly going to appreciate that our genetic code is increasingly readable, writable, and hackable. And that's going to change the way we do healthcare. It's going to change the way we make babies, and ultimately it's going to change the nature of the babies we make and our evolutionary trajectory as a species. And I've written the book because this is the story of us, and it's real, and it's imminent, and it's going to touch all of our lives really soon. And there are huge ethical issues. And the only way we're going to make sure that these incredibly powerful technologies are used to help us and less to hurt us is if we are all part of the process, if we have an engaged dialogue about what are the better uses and what are the worst uses of these technologies. So the book, it's written to be totally digestible. Any high school student could read it very comfortably. There's jokes in there. I mean, it has a very conversational
It's a
style.
very good book. It's very comprehensive.
Yeah, good. That's the goal.
How did a guy who worked for Richard Clarke at the State Department and for the National Security Council get involved in this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Dick, who was my former boss when I was on the National Security Council and the Clinton administration, he was really one of the inspirations for this book, because he then used to say, if everyone in Washington is focusing on one thing, you can be sure there's something much more important that's being missed.
For those who either need a memory jog or who don't know who Dick Clarke is, he wrote Against All Enemies. I think that was published in 2004.
Yeah.
And he was railroaded by the Republicans and by Fox News in particular for coming out against the administration. In fact, he was also railroaded by certain people on the left as well, because many people had aligned themselves with the Iraq War.
Right.
And Dick came out against it, and he criticized the Bush administration for missing red flags that he threw up about Osama bin Laden.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was in that office. And Dick used to always say that if everyone is focusing on one thing, everyone in Washington, you can be sure there's something much more important that's being missed. And so at that time, his issues were terrorism and cyber. And so starting more than 20 years ago, I started thinking really deeply about, well, what are those issues that are being missed? And I kept coming back to the burgeoning then genetics and biotech revolutions. And so I started educating myself, reading everything I could get my hands on, talking to people. And then I started writing articles. A member of Congress, Brad Sherman, read one of my articles, asked me to help him organize a hearing and be the lead witness. I was doing a lot of writing. And then I realized, well, this was such an important story. I wasn't breaking through to people. So then I wrote 2 near-term science fiction novels that deal with the issues of the science, but in a fictionalized story. And then when I was on my book tours for those novels, and when I explained the science to people the way a novelist would explain science, I could just see in their eyes, people were saying, holy shit, that's what this is? Like they'd heard these words, genetics, DNA, whatever, but they didn't know the story of how all the pieces fit together. And so that's when I realized I needed to write the story of the greatest transformation probably in the history of our species. And right now, people get that there are big changes that are happening. People understand China's rising. People get that AI is a big deal. Some people appreciate climate change. The story of the genetics revolution is bigger, and most people aren't really aware of what's happening. And because it's going to touch everybody, we have to change that.
Why is it bigger?
It's bigger Because how do we perceive the world? We perceive the world through who and what we are. And we are going to change that. And that, I said life has been on Earth, and so our precursor species go back almost 4 billion years. We've only been Homo sapiens for about 300,000 of those years. We've only been the only humans on Earth for about 40,000 years. So we're a really young species. And this was never the end point. Homo sapiens was never the end point. We're this buggy species. We have all these terrible diseases. We die young. So we were always going to change. And we are going to change. But now we are going to take active control of that process. And you can see how we're changing the world around us already with farming and industry and cities. But now we will have access to the source code of all of life. And that's a big deal.
How do you feel about that?
I'm mixed. On one hand, the history of our species is the history of our use of technology. I mean, if we didn't use our technology, we'd still be, running around in the savannas. And so I kind of like technology. I like that I don't have to die of terrible diseases, that I have a home that has heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. But there are real dangers. I mean, we have the ability, like with nuclear weapons, to wipe out life on Earth if we're not careful. We have the ability to use these technologies in ways that will undermine our humanity. And this is really sensitive stuff. I mean, if you had asked the Nazis what they thought they were doing, they would have said, we're implementing Darwin's theories. That was the core philosophical foundation of Nazism. And so I'm very sensitive. When I was giving a talk in Berkeley a few weeks ago with this wonderful man, a poet, whose daughter has Down syndrome, and he was talking about what a blessing she has been in his life. And that's true for everybody. And it was very sensitive for me to say that in 20 years from now, I don't think there are going to be very many kids born, at least in the developed world, with Down syndrome. That's already the case. But what does that say about us, about our sense of what is normal and abnormal, about what our values? So this is this is really sensitive stuff, and we need to be very prudent, and we need to be very thoughtful.
Well, I was meditating on identity. I was meditating on what makes me feel uncomfortable and what I think will make people feel uncomfortable and what seems okay.
Right.
And it seems to me that diseases, that things like Parkinson's or sickle cell anemia, no one has a problem getting rid of those. I'm sure some people do. But when it comes to Down syndrome, when it comes to deafness, when it comes to homosexuality, when it comes to some of these other genetically inheritable traits, or I don't know, what would the term be?
Heritable, yeah.
In the latter cases, those are identity-related ones, right?
Yeah.
These are related to identity. And in cases like Down syndrome, I was thinking about Life Goes On. Remember that show, Life Goes On? I think that was the first show, at least the first show I know of, that not necessarily normalized, I don't know, maybe that's the right word, but it brought Down syndrome into the public consciousness, and it took it sort of out of the closet, or it made it somehow people with Down syndrome are also people, and they have an identity. Not exactly the way that Tyrion Lannister did it for dwarfism, but because it's a fictional world, Game of Thrones, and Caitlyn Jenner with transgender. I think that what I wonder, so one, there's that, right? There's the fact that these people, let's say, won't exist anymore, and these are people, they're not diseases, right? And then also, what does that do in terms of our diversity? What do we lose by losing people who aren't, quote, perfect?
Yeah, and these are great and in many ways unanswerable questions, but we have to answer them anyway. And that is, the first thing is, how do we think about what's normal? How do we think about what is or isn't okay? And it's an illusion to think that we can just get outside of our culture, that there's some kind of objective reality of what is a disease, what is normal, what's abnormal. And yet, we are going to be faced with these kinds of choices because this diversity has just happened to us for 4 billion years. It was built into our biology. And now this force that was just built in, it wasn't optional, is something we're going to have to choose. So we better articulate what we mean by diversity. And certainly, it'll take something like Down syndrome. People who already exist with Down syndrome are wonderful people, and many of them, a very significant number, have pretty significant health issues. They have a shorter lifespan. Lots of them have heart problems. but really wonderful people who have an equal right as anybody else to thrive. But that's not the question that we're going to be asking. The question that we're going to be asking is, if you are having a baby and you have, let's say, 10 fertilized eggs, pre-implanted embryos in a lab, and you have to pick one of them to implant in the mother. They're all your natural children. Which is the one you will pick? And what will be the criteria you'll use to make that choice? And there's going to be a lot of culture that goes into that. There's going to be a lot of, all of our biases in the world will apply to those kinds of decisions. And I do think that it's extremely likely that people in that scenario will not choose to implant embryos with Down syndrome, because we already know that in Northern Europe, for example, where they have prenatal genetic testing, so you're already pregnant and you get tested at around 3 months, when there's a diagnosis of Down syndrome, the abortion rate is about 97%. So if people are already in parts of the world choosing to abort at almost 100%, they very likely aren't going to select to implant embryos with Down syndrome. And so we really need to think about, what diversity do we want, and who is the carrier of that diversity? So if we say that, well, we want to have, right now, there's a certain percentage of the population that has Down syndrome, and we want to maintain that percentage across the population in the future. How are we going to convince parents who are already aborting, people who are already pregnant, are already aborting embryos with that diagnosis? How are we going to convince them to have those kids, to choose to implant those embryos? And it's really complicated.
So that brings up something that we'll touch on later, which is the game theory of all of this, that well, what you think other people are going to do with this technology will impact what you do. So I think that that number would likely be smaller, of the number of abortions, if people didn't think that other people were going to do the same thing, and then thinking that their child is going to be basically one of only few with this particular disorder or mental disability or whatever it is. Where are we now? Let's bring it back here. So I said we're not going to cover how we got here, the revolution in genomics, but where are we today? What is standard practice, and what is cutting edge, and what sort of experimental that's happening?
So let me break it down into 3 areas. The first is in healthcare, because healthcare is the near-term, the most significant near-term application of genetic technologies. And so we are in a process of moving from our system of generalized medicine based on population averages to precision medicine based on each person's individual biology. So you'll get drugs based on an analysis of your own biology, which will be measured in many different ways, but the most important will be through having your sequenced genome as the foundation of your electronic health record. And then we have millions and then billions of people whose genetic information and phenotypic information of how those genes are expressed are in these big data pools. We're going to increasingly unlock the secrets of the genome. And so that's going to move us into this world of predictive health.
How many million genomes have been sequenced so far?
So now, well, it depends on what you mean by sequence. So in terms of the genotyping, which is like the mouth swabs, that's probably, let's say, 20 million. In terms of whole genome sequencing,
very few, right?
That's much. I've done it, but relatively small numbers of people have done it. But we're going to move, because the cost of sequencing is moving toward negligibility, and there'll be about 2 billion people within a decade who've been sequenced.
When people talk about genomic science moving at a rate faster than Moore's Law, are they referring to the cost of sequencing?
Yes. Yeah, the cost and the quality of sequencing. So it was, so about $1 billion in 2003, 800 now, and it'll be $50 within a decade.
Wow.
And so we're going to move into this world of predictive health. And that means you're going to be taking your baby home from the hospital, and the doctor's going to say, congratulations, it's a boy, and just FYI, this boy has a 50% greater than average chance of getting early onset familial Alzheimer's.
Straight out of Gattaca.
Yeah. And then you say, oh shit, like what does that mean? What do I do? But it's not just that. So then the second transformation will be this direct-to-consumer genetics. We don't have a disease genome. We don't have a healthcare genome. We have a human genome. And so as we unlock the secrets of the genome, it will be not just health information. It will be life information. So this same doctor coming home from the hospital will also say something like, your kid has a greater than average chance of being really fantastic at abstract math, or it's sprinting, or something else. And we're going to have to think about, how do we think about fate? How do we think about destiny? How do we think about choice when we start life with that information? And then the third area, and that's all happening already, and then the third area is in assisted reproduction. So right now, when a person goes for in vitro fertilization, for a woman, and then you can do embryo screening called preimplantation genetic diagnosis, and we can screen for mostly Mendelian single gene mutation disorders, things like sickle cell and Tay-Sachs. Yes. And for chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome, and then a small number of other things. But all this information that I've been talking about, we're going to have for these pre-implanted embryos. So we're going to be able to choose based on ranking embryos from likely tallest to shortest, likely highest IQ to lowest IQ, all these kinds of things.
How far are we from being able to do that? Because like height and intelligence, these are very complicated. There's not one gene for these things.
So height is being cracked now. I mean, so there's a lot of progress that's being made on genomic predictors for height. And so now it's not done, but it could be done. The science exists for a fertility clinic to say, we are going to make our best guess of ranking your, let's say, 15 or 10, whatever, embryos, pre-implanted embryos, based on likely tallest to likely shortest. It's not fully accurate, but directionally, and certainly you could identify outliers like super tall or super short. When will we be able to do that for the genetic component of IQ? My friend Steve Hsu, who's probably the leading expert on this, he thinks it's within a decade. Maybe he's right. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe it's 20 years, but it's coming.
Crazy. My cousin, everyone in my family is a physician. My daughter, my father. Yeah, that's interesting. What are your...
My father's a pediatrician. My mother's a psychologist. My oldest brother is a PhD, MD in psychiatry. My middle brother's a sports medicine doctor. And my baby brother's an orthopedic surgeon.
Oh, that's cool. No, my father is a prenatal diagnostic surgeon, perinatologist, and my uncle is a fertility doctor, and so is
perfect.
my cousin.
Yeah. Well, I'm speaking to the Fertility Doctors Association next week in Chicago.
Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah, so they have a huge surgical center downtown. I think their results are by far the best of any that exist. It's certainly in New York. But my cousin recently had a baby, his first child, and he selected the embryo himself.
Yeah.
So
what based on what criteria?
Oh, I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
Yeah.
But I think that's interesting, right? I mean, the doctor himself, that's a unique case.
Yeah, but I think we're all going to want to do that. And right now it's so scary for people because it's just different. But people are going to want to say, like, if there's let's say a 3% chance your kid is going to have some kind of harmful genetic abnormality, you're going to want to say, well, can we reduce that risk? Because that's 3% is not insignificant. And if you have these options for things that you really value, and I think health first and foremost, longevity, living a long and healthy life, people are going to want that. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have to figure out what is okay and what isn't okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was telling you before we turned on the microphones, I don't think I mentioned it when we turned them on, but when I was writing the Why Do I Care thing, I realized that what I was focused on, what mattered to me, what was affecting me emotionally or that was speaking to me were not the technical questions.
Right.
They were really the ethical, cultural ones.
Yeah.
And I think these are the most interesting and the most meaningful to people.
Yep.
Another thing that you talk about in the book, which I think is interesting and pertinent, is the differences between regions, countries, cultures, religions. You touched on it a little bit earlier. The Chinese, as far as I understand, are way out in front in terms of experimenting with this stuff, right? There was a physician...
He Zhonghui.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You pronounced that name correctly. Who, I think he's going to go to jail or something like that.
Yeah,
he didn't get consent. He didn't get informed consent from the parents.
I just did an event last night at the World Science Festival here in New York with Jennifer Doudna, who's the inventor of CRISPR-Cas9, future Nobel laureate.
That's great, yeah.
And we were talking about this, and there was a little bit of a kind of a mini debate between me and a Stanford bioethics professor who was also on the panel, and he was very sympathetic to her. And I said, this guy, I think he's a villain, he's a rogue, maybe he wasn't acting alone, but this is really just outrageous. And what he did was he genetically altered the embryos of what became 2 little girls born in China last October. And the reason it was so bad is, one, he was extremely secretive. He fudged the internal review board application, which was not for the hospital in which he was operating, but another one where he was an investor. He didn't get proper consents from the people who were receiving, the parents who were receiving these treatments for their embryos. He lied to them about what it was that they were getting. They weren't treating something, a disorder that existed. He was trying, it looks like unsuccessfully, to confer an enhancement. So it was just...
Well, he tried to disable the CCR5 gene, which has to do with HIV resistance, but it also is linked to higher levels of intelligence, right?
Well, there's some mouse studies that suggest that it could be, but there have been no human studies, so nobody really knows whether that's applicable to humans.
There's some other thing that came up when I was doing that research. It starts with an M. I'm not remembering
Mitochondrial transfer?
No, it's not a mitochondrial transfer. We're going to talk about that. But in any case, it's some of the genes inherit the
mosaicism.
That's it.
Yeah.
And there was also mosaicism.
Correct, exactly.
Right.
And so for something like what he was trying to do, which is to increase resistance to HIV, if you become a mosaic person and some of your cells are more resistant and some of your cells are less resistant, then you probably are overall less resistant.
Right. Disaster, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the thing that people worry about. It's because the Chinese have an authoritarian government. They have high levels of central control. Corporations, academia, et cetera, all these things function in a much more centralized way in terms of the party control.
Right.
That they're going to make huge leaps and advancements in this field and also in artificial intelligence. And given the fact that the hostilities that we talked about earlier, this is concerning. You know what I mean? Because if we can't, one of the things you talk about at the end of your book is that we need to have some sort of international approach to dealing with these problems. Good luck. Does not seem like it's even close to remotely possible. And the Chinese, by the way, don't seem like they have any intention to cooperate on any level.
Well, yes and
I don't
no.
necessarily blame them either, by the way. I mean,
yes and no. So there's a lot there. Let me just try to unpack it a little bit. Certainly, the story of the 21st century, one of the biggest stories will be this technology competition between China and the United States. The U.S. has the role we have in the world. We have been able to guide the world, to build this post-war international order that's benefited everybody because of the economic and geopolitical advantages that we have. China does not like that structure of the world, and China is gunning for something that's very different. I, for one, am much more comfortable with a world based around American values than I am for a world based on China's values.
I would never choose to live in that world.
Yeah, but that may be
our
where
world's imperfect. Their world is dystopian.
Well, yes, in many ways. And so what we need to do is to make sure that we continue to lead the world. And the United States has dropped the ball, certainly in these recent years, and China recognizes that technology, that leading technology is a major part of its agenda for having a much greater say in the world and being with their stated goal of being the world's leading country by the year 2050. And so there's a lot that's at stake here. And China has a political culture that's very different from ours. This technology, you get a Nobel Prize for figuring out how to do CRISPR-Cas9. And last night I was saying, and you get an A in your high school biology class for applying it. But then this high school biology teacher who was in my talk last night came and said, hey, you said you get an A in high school biology for applying CRISPR. You don't. Like, just applying, you get a B or a C, and you have to do it really well. So this is out of the bag. And so we don't know where this is going to go. So the question is, will we have a genetic free-for-all? There's a real chance for that. This book was already in production when the news came out that these genetically engineered babies, genetically altered babies had been born in China. I had to pull it back out of production, but I didn't have to make very significant changes because I'd already said, this is going to happen. It's going to happen in China, and here's why. And then I just added a few sentences, and it did on this day. And when the news first broke, in the first few hours after this story came out, there was a lot of triumphalism in China. Like, we did it. We're going to win this Nobel Prize. This is China leapfrogging over the West, and now we're this leading technological country. But then when there was
Don't say we didn't warn you.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. No, but then when there was this international backlash,
right?
China immediately, and to its credit, its government leaders recognized that, hey, wait a second, if we want to lead the world, if we want to be a science powerhouse, we can't be this Wild West. And so China has now pulled back, at least in public ways. And so I do think that China is a stakeholder because they don't want to be North Korea. They don't want to be a rogue actor. They want to be the central power in the world. And so I think there is an opportunity for us to find some common ground. Maybe it's not entire common ground, but some common ground.
So you mentioned mitochondrial transfers.
Yeah.
Was that the word you used?
Yeah.
So that, I think the first time that was done was, 2014?
Yeah, very recent. Yeah.
Right. It's basically where you take a fertilized egg, an egg that's been fertilized, a mother's egg, the parents, let's say mother and father. The egg's been fertilized. You then take a donor egg. You take out the nucleus from the donor egg. You take the nucleus from the fertilized egg of the parents, and you put it in the donor egg.
Yep.
And now what you've done is you have 99%, parents' DNA.
Right.
But you've got a small amount of
mitochondrial
DNA.
Yeah.
And that was done originally for mitochondrial disease, but recently this was done in Greece. Very recent, like in May, some results came out about having been done to deal with chronically infertile or patient.
Yeah. So there's two ways of doing it. One is at the egg level, and one is at the early stage embryo level, zygote level. And yes, so this case happened in Greece, happened once in Mexico, it's happened in Ukraine. It's almost certainly happened now in the United Kingdom, approved by their government through a very elaborate and responsible process. It's not yet authorized in the United States, and it's very controversial because it's gotten wrapped up a little bit in the abortion.
Are we going to fall behind because we have such a religious community?
Well, we need to find a way to move forward with our religious community. I certainly would never begrudge anybody for their philosophy, especially something that's so sacred and intimate about their sense of when life begins. But
well, because remember, I just want for the audience as well, I remember when the Bush administration put a hold on stem cell research, and Michael J. Fox came out with an ad on the Super Bowl, and Rush Limbaugh was making fun of him flailing around and saying that he hadn't taken his medication. In fact, he'd actually been overdosing on his medication.
Yeah.
It's clearly a very sensitive issue.
It really, and we need to find a way to have this conversation together, because right now we can't have a conversation about abortion. So you just say the word, everybody scurries behind their barricades, and we can't have that conversation. We have to have this conversation, because why is it that we have people picketing outside of clinics that perform abortions, but nobody's picketing outside of clinics that are fertility clinics where people are getting IVF? And the reason is because people, even in the most conservative evangelical communities, they want to have babies. They're seeing these older people, the older parents coming with babies, these high-risk people getting babies, and they recognize that this is the miracle of life. And I don't think that, maybe there are some outliers in the traditional religious conservative community who think that, well, it's okay, that it's good to implant an embryo, let's say of a child who's going to have incredible suffering and die before they're one. Let's say you're choosing from among these 10 embryos that we're talking. Some people will say that. But I think other people recognize that there's a difference between a fertilized egg in a dish in a lab and a 30-year-old human being. And I think that this is really, really difficult. And it's difficult for people to be honest about compromises that they have already made. But we have to find a way to have this balance. And we have to find a way to build a table that's big enough for everyone to sit at. Because what happens if we say, all right, we're having this conversation about where our species is going, but you could be religious conservatives, or it could be transhumanist biohackers, like there's not a seat for you at this table. People are going to do their own thing, and then we're worse off.
I agree with that. When we were talking about mitochondrial transfer, that was technically 3 parents,
correct.
Although one was, I said 99%, was like 99.99 whatever percent. Right. How many genes are there in mitochondria?
It's like 37.
Right, nothing.
Like that,
How far are we from being able to have children from multiple parents where the genes are more evenly expressed? What would it take to get to that place?
We're not going to want to, and I think
you don't think so?
I think it would be very, very difficult. I know, because people have this conception. I think it's a misconception that we're going to sit at a computer and you're just going to have a menu of all the different, it's like Build-A-Bear. and I just think that...
What an awful,
I know, but I don't think that's what even
vision.
within the... Because the complexity of our biology is just monumental. So that's why I think embryo selection, in my mind, and I write about this, I think that's the killer application.
But why wouldn't you be able to do what I'm suggesting? Couldn't you fertilize an egg and then fertilize another one?
Yes, but if you wanted to mix and match that DNA, you'd have to cut and paste. So you'd have to take big sections of DNA from one of these embryos or cells
messy.
And place it in another. And because our genes are all doing so many different things, it gets really complex. So the greatest in my mind, the greatest living geneticist. The world's Charles Darwin of today is George Church, who's a Harvard professor. And George and I do a decent amount of events.
He's a funny guy. What an interesting humor he has.
Oh, he's wonderful.
He has an under-the-radar humor. I bet he makes jokes all the time. People don't catch it if they don't know him.
No, he's incredible and so creative.
Very
and
creative.
He thinks, so we were just speaking together at Harvard a month ago, and he said that he thought within 10 years we'd be able to make thousands of concurrent genetic changes to human cells. And the way he's imagining doing it is not making changes at the early stage embryo level, but doing it at the egg and sperm precursor level. And because when you do that, you don't yet have the ethical issue of a potential or early stage human. This is just gene editing egg precursor cells and sperm precursor cells, and you can do it in the millions. And so you don't need to be maybe as careful, and it's throwing away things that don't work as easier. So he thinks that we're going to be making many thousands of gene edits to these egg and sperm precursor cells. And it's possible, but my view is that there is just such an incredible complexity to our biology that interventions that don't require a complete understanding of how everything works, and I certainly put embryo selection in that category, I think will be prioritized. And then small numbers of gene edits, either that significantly reduce risks or confer advantages, I think that we'll do that. But in 20 years, do I think we'll be making 5 or 10 individual edits to pre-implanted embryos? I think almost certainly. Do I think we're going to be making 10,000? No.
Right. Well, there are two parallel tracks here. One is the editing technologies, right, and the ability to make those edits, and the other one is the genomic science, the mapping of the genome, understanding what you're looking at and what you're doing.
Right.
Something that George highlights, the dangers of working on a genome that you don't understand. Yeah. Speaking of George, though, is he going to bring back the woolly mammoth?
So the thing that he's talking of bringing back is not, in fact, a woolly mammoth. It's like a funky Asian elephant. And so
with hair,
with a lot of mutations that will make it could make it function like a woolly mammoth. And it's probably doable. I mean, I think whether it's going to happen or not.
How far along is it?
I don't know. I've talked to him about that, and nobody really knows. But it's possible to gene edit embryos. It's possible to confer traits. And it's the kind of thing, if it looks enough like a woolly mammoth, it's kind of like a woolly mammoth. And so that's the kind of the basic message of this, is that we recognize that our information technology is variable, but we think about our biology as being fixed. But biology is variable. Biology is hackable, and we are going to have the increasing ability to hack it.
Right. Well, they got that DNA from some frozen specimen that he said was like majestic. It was an entire specimen. And he was staring at it.
And so that ability to sequence genomes from entities that exist a very long time, but that's
called de-extinction. Well, not the actual sequencing.
But the sequencing, it's basically what you need to do is amplify genetic information so you can tell the full story. And that's what's helping to get all this information about Neanderthals, about the Denisovans, and also other extinct
When you say
species.
amplify, how do you mean that word?
So when you get all the cells, the biological material deteriorates over time. And so it's just like, imagine...
Do you get noise, though?
Well, you do, but that's why having these algorithms that help identify what's what.
Crazy.
And so just like, imagine you have an old book.
Wow.
And you get the old book, and it's got water damage. And there's some places where there's letters and some where there's not. And then how do you begin to tell the story of the whole book?
Because most of that stuff is present in other animals in the species.
Well, that's
so they
part
can
of
tell.
it. So you can fill in, you can look at related animals, and you can start to fill in some of the story. And then once you do it once you have a reference genome, then it changes the game, because with all this new information, you can map on to what you have.
But you can only recover lost parts if those aren't unique to that particular species, if it's the first time that you're sequencing its genome, or to that animal, right?
Well, I guess so. It would be you would just need enough genetic information.
This brings us to the big data and machine intelligence part of this,
right?
Yeah. And so he would implant this in a soon-to-be very surprised matriarch elephant.
I'm not even surprised. Who looks into themselves when they're pregnant? It's like, oh, I'm pregnant.
But when it would come out, she'd see it. She'd see the baby with hair on it. She'd be like, what happened to my kid?
And then she'd think, maybe it was that one night in the bar.
when I screwed that gorilla.
Exactly. that elephant. That hairy elephant.
Yeah, exactly. There was another interesting thing that I read about this, which is that the idea is to actually also use, I don't know how much this is just kind of after the fact, trying to push the research forward, but to use the elephant to help combat issues around methane gas emissions from permafrost in the Arctic.
I mean, that's the justification. And I'm sure, like, with that goal, there are different ways to do it. Resuscitating the woolly mammoth is probably not the top if you just started from scratch, but maybe it could.
So that's a case where they're basically saying, because most people would look at this and say, what are the risks associated with bringing back an endangered or an extinct species? In this case, they're saying it could actually be helpful.
We live in these complex ecosystems that are adaptive.
Right.
So
what about bringing back a virus?
You could bring back anything.
I think Church said that they reconstituted the 1918 flu. It wasn't him. It was some
it was a horsepox. It happened, I think, in Vancouver. Somewhere in Canada, there was a lab. They spent $100,000, and they created this strain of horsepox, which is variant very closely connected to smallpox. And so all this stuff is possible. And so we are, as I was saying, we are gaining access to the toolkit of life, and we better use it responsibly.
I heard Church also say something about how genetically altering the human genome could actually make people resistant to all viruses.
Oh, yeah.
How does that work?
Well, just there are some people who are more resistant to viruses than others. And so for certain viruses, like we talked about CCR5 and HIV, so we could give people a suite of genetic mutations that would increase their resistance to certain viruses or maybe many viruses. So all these things happen, but prudence is required because all of our genes are doing a lot of different things. So we need to be careful, but there's no written law. There's no natural law that this form, that this moment of our evolution is this optimal outcome and you can't do better than this. Like even if we didn't have any of this technology, we would still continue to evolve. And there's not better and worse in evolution. It's just that our environment is going to change and we will have to adapt to fit that environment. And maybe because we are actively changing our environment so rapidly, we may need to change certain parts of ourselves in order to keep up.
Yeah, so that brings us to the socio-economic dimensions of this.
Right.
Who gets access to this technology and what does it mean practically?
Right. So that's a values question, and the answer is it depends on what our values are. If our values are what they should be, that this is
But money can buy you whatever you want.
Yeah, but
right?
There are some societies, I mean, right now, when we think of this in the context of healthcare, there are some societies that have national healthcare systems, like Israel, where assisted reproduction is provided pretty liberally and paid for by the state. There are others, like the United States, where people pay a ton of money and kind of get very little back. So it's a value statement about access. It should be, every society should have an interest in the long-term health and well-being of its population.
Does China?
In their way, maybe. I mean, in the sense
as long
maybe what you're going to say, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power. But if you're in the Chinese Communist Party, you're thinking, well, we are the best. That's what you tell yourself when you wake up in the morning. We are the best stewards of China.
Well, that's what our politicians also say.
Yeah. And that we need to make collective decisions that sometimes are going to hurt people. And I certainly am not sympathetic, so that we need to murder these protesters at Tiananmen Square because there's this greater vision of China that we believe in. So everybody has a story, but what we need to do is to make sure that we are living our values. If we believe in equity, if we believe that in the future we don't want to have genetic haves and have-nots, we should start applying those values today.
But if I'm Bill Gates' kid, or if I'm Barack Obama's daughter,
right,
and I'm going to have a baby in 10 years or something like that, can't I just go wherever I want? I'll just pay for it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the end, this brings us back to the game theory. The people that are going to have access to it,
absolutely, and there will be jurisdictions, and whether it's little countries or cruise ships on the high seas.
What does that mean, right? I mean,
what
does that mean?
It means that we better have an inclusive global dialogue about where we're going. That we need to make sure that every country has a regulatory system, and we need to help make that happen. And we need to try to build global norms. I mean, for many decades, it's been possible to wipe out everyone on Earth using biological weapons. It hasn't happened. Why hasn't it happened? One of the reasons is we've established norms against their use. I don't think it's so crazy to think that we can establish norms that aren't going to be perfect, but it's certainly better than the alternative.
When were those standards put in place against biological warfare?
It's been over time, but in the 50s, 60s,
Right,
and
it was
70s.
after the war,
Yeah.
after the Second World
and
War.
then there are all the various upgrades. And so I think we have to get started. We're not going to do this all at once.
And chemical weapons was after the First World War, right?
Well, that certainly chemical weapons was, I mean, the horrors
The
of
mustard
chemical
gas
weapons
in the
were shown
trenches.
in the First World
That's
War.
what worries me.
Yeah.
What worries me is that we ban things after they've been proven to be very dangerous.
And that's the challenge of me.
I mean, if we hadn't dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I wonder if we would have been so tight with our usage afterwards.
And the challenge for me, so my book came out a month ago, and I'm out talking every day to great people like you, and I'm trying to tell people, hey, this is so important. You need to pay attention. And for most people, like if you kind of sit down and if they're 60 minutes into this interview, they're saying, all right, I get something is important. But for most people in their day-to-day lives, they're not thinking about the genetics revolution as something that's really going to touch them. But if we wait 10 years until when this issue arises, then it's going to be too late because the big decisions will have already been made. So we can't wait for a crisis in order to get smart on this stuff. And also because the technology is moving faster than it ever has. And that's why I've written the book. That's why I really want to bring people into this conversation, because if you're not educated, if you're not part of this conversation and trying to figure out how we best respond, this is just going to happen to you and it's going to change your life and you're not going to be comfortable with that.
So this is what's disturbing. Again, this brings me back to what I was telling you before we started and right at the beginning of the episode when I wrote the Why Do I Care part, and I was thinking about how this made me feel. Yeah. And I remembered one of my favorite movies ever is Gattaca. Mm-hmm. I watched that back in 98 when it came out, or 99, shortly after it came out. And that movie moved me. Yeah. You know, it spoke to a lot of the things that I feel to be true. But it never felt like it was something that I would ever have to consider in my lifetime. Yeah. And perhaps not even in my children's lifetimes. Yeah. You see here, I have a picture also of Captain Kirk and Khan from the episode in the 60s, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, not the Wrath of Khan. Khan was one of the supermen from the late 90s, right? The idea was that these people were genetically engineered to be incredibly powerful and everything else. But again, 1960s, this was science fiction. Yeah. This isn't science fiction anymore. And it feels really uncomfortable. And it feels like the future that we're describing here and we're talking about doesn't feel like home.
Yeah, no, I get it.
I don't know. Do you feel that ever? Do you feel like
both.
This doesn't feel like home?
Well, I feel both because we all have this instinctive pull toward this thing. Some of us call it home. Some of it call it nature. And basically what it means is the thing that we experienced when we were young. Because all the things that you experienced when you were young that feel like home, those aren't natural human things, like being born in a hospital, living in a house, living in a city, agriculture, medicine. These are all just massive applications of technology to the human experience. And
but they're familiar.
They're familiar to us.
Right.
But when we went from living on the farm to living in the cities, it freaked people out. That felt so unfamiliar. When we went from hunting to farming, all these technologies don't feel like home.
So there is an argument to be made that nature is natural, so to speak, that there is a natural home. That's one thing, right?
Yeah, but nature
the
is
idyllic landscape.
Yeah, what we call, and I mentioned this with Joe Rogan, what we call nature is not natural at all. Like in nature, if we mean like how our ancestors a long time ago lived, that sucked. You live in a freaking cave. The second you step out, some kind of horrible creature is going to eat you. You die of terrible diseases. That sucked. And that's why we've applied technology to our lives, and we're still going to do it.
Right. So there's that one line of reasoning, right? But then there's the other one where I'm going down, which has to do with rate of change. Mm-hmm. So some people will say people are not built to live in cities. Rogan said, of course people are built to live in cities. Right. We made them. We've always been living them. I'm not making an argument one way or the other about that. What I'm saying is, are human beings meant to live in a world that only changes so much in their lifetime? I think the answer to that is resoundingly yes. I don't think people can adjust to any rate of change. And I think we see it politically when change becomes too quick. People rebel. They reject the program.
It's true. And yet that is the very nature of change, because change is cumulative.
It's not exponential.
Well, a lot of change is exponential.
Well, no, it is, but I'm saying it's not necessarily the nature of change.
Maybe it is.
In the human experience.
Maybe it is, because like the more you change, the greater your opportunity for change. I mean,
but we're not evolved to deal with that. We're evolved to deal with linear rates of change.
That's the problem. Is our brains formed in many ways in the savannas, and if you're the exponential thinker on the savanna and you're kind of looking up saying, wow, someday we're going to have flying machines, you're the first guy who gets eaten by the saber-toothed tiger, because the other guys have these very practical minds.
A simpler time.
Which is like when you hear rustling in the bushes, run. And so, yes, our brains aren't set up for that. And we may need to change, and we will change many aspects of how we live. We will co-evolve with our technology. We will alter our biology. But the only way that we slow the pace of change is with some kind of catastrophic outcome, like global thermonuclear war or some kind of pathogen that wipes us.
Jesus Christ.
Change is real, and we have to learn to live with it. But more importantly, we can't hold on to some nostalgic and even false view of this imagined past. What we need to do is to say, what's constant for us is not our technology, it's our values. It's our values. And how do we weave our values into the world that we're building so the values are familiar, even though the context will change?
I've done a number of episodes. I'm thinking specifically of my episode with Cal Newport on digital minimalism and the episode that we did with Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism. Yeah. Talking about the role of these mobile devices and the behavioral algorithms that run in the background on the quality of our lives, I'm of the mindset that I think people are going to kick the bucket on this. I think they're going to, at some point there's going to be a tip, and as simple as people are going to stop using their mobile device. They're going to start using a burner. I think not because they're afraid that they're being watched, but because having this device, which gives you access to the entire universe and which is feeding you increasingly curated content and alerts, is going to so destroy the quality of your life that you're going to become aware of it because of the work of people like Shoshana and other people, that you're just going to stop using it.
Yeah, well,
because the quality of your life goes down the toilet.
I feel that.
We all feel it.
Yeah.
You're not. We all feel it.
I was just on this book tour, and book tours are these crazy things where you're you have this thing. It's like this baby. It's like ideas I've been thinking about for 2 decades, and then just kind of launching it into the world. And then you have all this stuff coming at you, interview requests and things. And I found myself just going in with my phone. I'd do an interview with you. I'd leave. I'd check messages, respond, go to the next interview. And I was going crazy.
God.
And I was talking about the future of what it means to be a human. And I felt like I was becoming less human. I was becoming less myself without the... So to say that the change is going to just be continuous doesn't mean that every kind of change that we can imagine is good or what we want. But we have to define what it is that we're comfortable with. And this is all going to happen within the context of diverse societies and competitive societies. So there will be drivers that won't be entirely individual and personal.
One of the questions that Shoshana asks, and we discussed on the show, is who decides?
Yeah.
Right? Who decides? Yeah. Does it concern you that the engineers, at least the Silicon Valley ones, who are especially transhumanists, who are thinking about things like living forever and who are designing so many of these applications that are running on our devices and engineering our future, that these people are the least human among us? They're the most on the spectrum. They have the least social skills.
Yeah.
The things they value are not the things that I value.
Yeah.
They're less artistic. They're less romantic. They're more quantitative. And they're the ones that are selecting what is best for us. It's not surprising to me that they say ridiculous things like, we're going to upload our consciousness. That is an absurd statement. When Ray Kurzweil, and I've met Ray, I've heard him speak, totally nice guy, whatever, totally crazy. Makes no sense. He has absolutely no basis to make that statement. We have no clue what consciousness is. The entire idea that you're just going to upload your, quote, consciousness to the cloud is ridiculous, and they're saying this stuff like it's real.
So about 6 weeks ago, I was in Japan. I was giving a lecture tour hosted by the Japanese government. And it was this great thing where they said, just make a list of anyone in Japan you'd like to meet with, and we'll set it up. So one of the people who I listed and who I met with was this incredible guy, Hiroshi Ishiguro. And so Ishiguro-san, he's the leading humanoid roboticist in the world. He's on the cover of Wired. And so this guy, he's incredible. We went there. And he himself, he felt like a robot. As a matter of fact, he has a robot replica of himself, and he keeps getting plastic surgery because as he gets older, he wants to still look like his robot. I guess it's probably easier to put wrinkles on your robot.
Crazy.
And so we had this debate about the future of humanity, and he was saying that the future of humanity is non-biological. And I said, if our future is non-biological, either we have committed suicide or these non-biological entities have killed us. But there is something that's inherently biological about us. You know, I do a lot of speaking at big tech events, and I had a lunch once with some of the most well-known tech founders of the biggest Silicon Valley companies. And it was really interesting. It was me and this one other guy who were both speakers at the conference, and then there were all these guys who were the tech founders. And we were like this traveling circus show trying to keep a conversation going, like kind of more familiar people might. And these other guys who were like unbelievable geniuses, it was very clear that they were kind of somewhere on the spectrum. It doesn't make them less or more human. And so we just like...
Well, kind of, some of them it makes them less human.
Well,
I understand.
Because this is what we're talking about is our humanity and how do we define our humanity?
I mean, if you can't hold a normal, what most people consider to be a normal conversation, that's fine. In other words, it's not a criticism of you as a person.
Yep.
You are a person. You are human.
Yep.
But you don't get to decide, in my view, what is human. It doesn't make sense to take an outlier person and make him decide what is.
No, I agree. And that's why I think my answer for Shoshana, maybe Shoshana's answer for you, and my answer for myself is that we have to be the deciders. And for us to be the deciders, we have to empower ourselves. And the way we empower ourselves is first with knowledge and then with voice. And then we have to engage the people around. We have to build communities around these ideas. We have to engage our political leaders and say, hey, this issue is important. What are you doing about it? But if we just stand back and let it happen, it will happen led by the people who feel they are the greatest stakeholders.
People like Mark Zuckerberg are just trying to railroad this future down people's throats. Joe Rogan said it perfectly. We have a bunch of people who are totally uneducated on these matters, who didn't even do the proper job of preparing themselves for their congressional testimony of Mark Zuckerberg when he came
senators,
to... Yeah, exactly, the senators. I'm not given any confidence in this matter whatsoever.
But we live in a democracy.
Right.
We have to organize. Like, it's great for us to talk, and actually being on a podcast like this is an action.
Yeah,
it's an important action. But then we decide, what's the next action? How do we build these communities? Because in any issue, there are the people who feel they're greater stakeholders and less stakeholders. And the greater stakeholders will always drive issues. I mean, look at gun control in the United States. The majority of Americans want to have sensible restrictions on gun ownership, but they're not that motivated. The people who are the pro-gun people, they're more organized and more motivated around this single issue, and so they get the voice. And what we have to say is this stuff is really important, and we want a voice. But to have that, we have to do the hard work first.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, I want to move us into the overtime.
Sure.
The things that when you were talking about our future being silicon, is that what he said?
Yeah, non-biological.
Non-biological. I think it was Church who was talking about this, but he's not the only one, about the carrying capacity of the human brain in terms of as an information storage device and its resilience.
Kurzweil also talks about there's not enough space. We have to expand it with the cloud.
Right. But that we would actually be able to use organic material, carbon-based storage units, in a sense, right, to store information. I think that's what Church was saying in this lecture that I saw.
I haven't seen that, but I know that Ray Kurzweil says that we need to have some brain-machine interface so that we can have excess storage in the cloud.
I know. Well, there's actually a really cool company here in New York City that has a brain-machine interface that uses... I forget, it's the neural signals, I forget the name of it, but it uses the neural signals from your spine to your hands and your fingers.
Yeah.
And it's pretty damn good.
Yeah.
So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about synthetic biology, some stuff like this.
Yeah.
Also biotech and biohacking.
Yeah.
And what people are doing with that.
Really important topics.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And a few other topics, and maybe we can kind of touch a bit on North Korea, because you had visited North Korea.
Yeah, twice.
Yeah, which is fascinating. I want to talk to you about that and a few other things. For those who are regular listeners, you know the drill. If you're new to the show, head to patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Or go to hiddenforces.io/subscribe to learn about the subscription and how you can access the overtime, as well as the transcript of this week's episode, as well as the episode rundown, which I always tell you guys is a beautiful document full of notes and links and charts and pictures of Captain Kirk in this case.
I can see the pictures. They look
right.
great.
And
Hey, Dimitri, sorry
Ethan Hawke.
to interrupt you, but I'm going to add to this because podcasts like this are so important. It's a new form of media, and so many people are using it. And we've all been socialized to this idea that everything ought to be free. But really, it's a lot of hard work that goes into creating this kind of content. And it's really important. And you're saying if you subscribe, you'll get this extra stuff. And the extra stuff is great. And now that we're going into overtime, I'm going to tell all of my deepest, darkest secrets. I'm not going to tell anybody else. And that's really great. But it's not that much. I just think that people, let's say you have 5 or 6 podcasts that you listen to regularly, that you feel, now this sounds like NPR.
Please don't stop.
That you feel are giving you something. And it's worth that little bit, like the cost of a few coffees a week, that just empowers this kind of content. And if we're all using it, we have to recognize that if we don't pay for this stuff that's going to enrich us, we're not going to have it.
I really appreciate you saying that. No one's ever done that before, and I feel really uncomfortable saying it, but it's true.
Yeah.
The guest I told you before, I'm not going to mention his name to the audience because I wanted to be surprised, but I was contacted by the staff of one of the former secretaries of defense. There are only 4 of them, okay?
Right.
Now, I was told that the staff listens to the show, his wife listens to the show, and I'm assuming he listens to the show. Yeah. So this is an important program, and I have been doing it largely for free. So, and I have said to my audience that I want to just cover the costs of it. We're 1/3 of the way there, and I'm very grateful since we launched the subscription in January. But I hope that we can get all the way there. And I do appreciate all your support, and I do know that not everyone can support the show, and I want to try to make it possible for some of you to do it at a lower cost and get something in return. But Jamie, thank you so much for staying for the overtime, and let's switch to the overtime.
Awesome.
And that was my episode with Jamie Metzl. I want to thank Jamie for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.